Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. We are beginning our new journey through the Gospel of Matthew, and we're going to be in chapter 1. And again, Matthew, the Apostle Matthew, he was one of Jesus' chosen apostles. And the reason for when Jesus was here, and I'm not going to go too deep into that because we will uncover this in our journey, in our studies through the gospel. But the purpose of the apostles, that Jesus chose 12 apostles, they would be, and then they was with Jesus for the 3.5 years, and then he communicated the revelation of the church by far to them. There were other disciples, we'll get into those later, and then they would be the foundation of the New Testament. Okay, so we'll get into that later. So let's get into it. Let's begin our journey. Now, I kind of gave an introduction last time, but let me just say this. Matthew, what was interesting about Matthew, he was a tax collector, hated by the Jewish people, which made it interesting that Jesus chose him as one of his apostles. There were um, a couple of characters that Jesus chose that you would say, Jesus, why did you choose them? However, when you look at the effect of the grace of God, then especially with Matthew's gospel presents the most Jewish Jesus of all of the four gospels. Okay, so he went from being a tax collector to one of an apostle that gave us, again, one of the greatest stories, revelations about the life of Jesus. Now, okay, here we go. Now, Matthew chapter 1, and it said, verse 1, the historical record of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Now, because, again, Jesus is presenting a very Jewish Jesus, it is extremely important that his genealogy is traced back to Abraham. Well, to two characters, David and Abraham. The Messiah had to come from that bloodline. Notice he says this is the historical record. And I kind of want to emphasize that because a lot of times you will hear people that will try to argue that there is no record of Jesus, that there, excuse me, that there is no, evidence that Jesus existed. And that's simply not true. This is a historical document about Jesus. The four Gospels are historical documents and stories about Jesus. Now you may say, well, how do we know? How do we prove that? Well, for that matter, how do you prove any writings of history, right? I mean, if you any writing, how do you know? As of right now, how do you know we have the accurate story about Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, right? You have historical writings. Now, here is the thing. There are false stories about Jesus. There are false stories about anyone, any particular person, as far as the gospel is concerned. Or any story. Are there any other records that would contradict the historical writings here? So that would be, in other words, there are none. And by the way, the gospel singularly are the most reliable accounting of Jesus' life. So what you have is you have two of the gospel written by Jesus' own apostles. The other two were written by people who were directly connected to the eyewitnesses of Jesus. So again, if you can prove that there is historical writings out there that contradict whatever the story. Now, when we think about stories in history, and there's always a conspiracy behind something, right? The assassination of President John F. Kennedy. There are gobs of conspiracies about that, but none of them pan out to be true. Besides the fact that you actually have records, you have recordings, you have hundreds of people that were there, you have cameras and films that were there. So anyway, so the same thing, the establishment of the historical record here is through eyewitnesses and through the telling of, in Matthew's case, he was actually there. And so the historical record of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So this historical record is talking about his lineage, his genealogy. So he's going to say, now Matthew's, by the way, genealogy. Now, I'm going to read them, and you're going to have to bear with genealogies, because a lot of people find genealogies hard to follow. And yes, they are. We went through the Old Testament, and especially in Chronicles, but I think he had almost 10 chapters worth of genealogies. And the genealogies kind of serves as two purposes. One, it established the bloodline of Jesus. So that is the main purpose of genealogies, to establish the bloodline of Jesus, which is extremely important. To the Jewish people, genealogies were important from a lineage purpose, inheritance purpose, so that even in the dividing of the land in the country, so each tribe had their particular genealogies that they had to prove. Okay. Now, there are other genealogies, and we're not going to read them here. This genealogy is only the bloodline of Jesus. If you go back in Chronicles, again, it's just chapter after chapter of genealogies. I think Genesis chapter 5, you have a long genealogies. One of the purpose is to show bloodlines that lead away from that lead away from Jesus. In other words, remember, Jesus, for as his record is concerned, had to come from the bloodline of David and Abraham. Okay? So, all right. So verse 2 says, Abraham fathered Isaac. And again, remember, he's only concerned here about the bloodline of Jesus. So we know that Abraham fathered not only Isaac, but Ishmael. Not Ishmael. Not Ishmael. Yeah, Ishmael. Okay. So Isaac and Ishmael were brothers, but you don't see his recording here because we're not concerned with Ishmael's bloodline. You do see Ishmael's bloodlines in the Old Testament, again, in Chronicles. So Abraham fathered Isaac. Isaac fathered Jacob. Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Now, Tamar is very interesting. You're going to have at least three pagan women who are in the direct bloodline of Jesus. And then also interesting enough that Matthew brings that out. So Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Aram. Aram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz by Rahab. Excuse me. Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered King David. Okay. Now, there's a couple of things about this. Mouth is really, really dry. Let's try something else here. All right. Two more women appear, Rahab and Ruth. Now, Rahab was a harlot who was saved when the Israelites crossed over the Jordan to possess the land. She hid the spies, but she also, and this is important, she had embraced the God of Israel. She had faith in the God of Israel. Rahab's story is a very interesting story in that Jericho had heard about Israel. All of those nations heard about Israel and what God had done to Egypt, which put Israel to shame because, remember, they wandered 40 years in the wilderness because they thought they couldn't conquer the land. And the truth was, all of those nations feared Israel. And when they crossed the Jordan, they locked up the city and were terrified. But here is the difference. Rahab was the only one that embraced God and hid the spies. The other people, though they were terrified by God, they tried to destroy the spies and tried to prevent the invasion of Israel. Now, Ruth was a Moabitess who came from a wicked country, a nation. So here you see these three women, Ruth, Rahab, and Tamar, in the direct bloodline of Jesus. And then it says here, then David fathered Solomon by Uriah's wife. And that was, of course, a scandal. Solomon fathered Rehoboam. Now, Rehoboam was a fool. And at this point, this is when you see the northern and the southern kingdom split because of his foolishness. Rehoboam fathered Abijah. Abijah fathered Asa. Asa fathered Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat fathered Jeroboam. And Jeroboam fathered Uzziah. Now, Uzziah was a very good king. Uzziah fathered Jotham. Jotham fathered Ahaz. Ahaz fathered Hezekiah, who was another good king. Hezekiah fathered Manasseh. And here is the very interesting thing here. Hezekiah was one of the most godly of Judah's kings. But then Manasseh was by far the most wickedest of of Judah's kings. And because of Manasseh, he sealed the doom for the Babylonian exile. Because of him, God said, this is it. He was so wicked, he said, they've gone beyond the term, beyond the point of return. He said, Manasseh fathered Ammon, Ammon fathered Josiah, and Josiah, this king, was prophesied 200 years before he was born, by name, okay? By name. And then Josiah fathered Jehoiakim and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. And then he says that after the exile to Babylon, Jehoiakim fathered Shealtiel, and Shealtiel fathered Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel fathered Abiud. Now, a lot of these kings we never hear of because we're going into the intertestament period. Zerubbabel is talked about a lot in Zechariah, Haggai. Okay, he was one of the kings right after the exile. And then it says Abiud fathered Eliakim, Eliakim fathered Azar, Azar fathered Zodak, and Zodak fathered Achim, Achim fathered Eliud, and Eliud fathered Eleazar, Eleazar fathered Mattan, Matan fathered Jacob. And Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary, who gave birth to Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Now, what is very odd about Matthew's recording, as opposed to other Jewish writings in the Bible, that you rarely see the women mentioned by name, but you also see the impact. Now, verse 17, he says, so all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David unto the exile to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the exile to Babylon were the Messiah, 14 generations. Now, I think it's important to also look at how generations are used here. I say that because later on down the road, when we get to Matthew 24, and you see a lot of people, for some kind of way, I don't even know how this came about, where people say that a generation was 40 years. Now, we went through the entire Bible, and I've yet to see anywhere where a generation was numbered as 40 years. But as you can look here, the generations are numbered as people, times of people, right? So each person is a generation. Their children is another generation, right? And so that's how generation is defined. My father is a generation. I'm a generation. My children are a generation. My grandchildren are a generation. And now even my great-grandchild is a generation. So you got like what, 6 generations right there. So that's how a generation is defined. And another thing that's also interesting about these generations, notice he says from Abraham to David was 14 generations, from David unto the exile of Babylon, 14 generations. And the reason why I want to highlight Babylon is because Babylon was a turning point in human affairs. So you went from tribal, you had mighty kingdoms, and then you come to Babylon, and he is the first world dominating kingdom. And the prophetic, what you have in terms of the prophetic picture, is 5 world dominating kingdoms unto the second coming of Jesus Christ. And so in that prophetic dream that God had given Daniel, or actually gave Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel interpreted, you start with Babylon, and at the time of this writing, you're in the the Roman kingdom, or the Roman Empire. so human. Not only did the exile change Israel, because what you had was, I said, remember, Solomon's son Rehoboam, because of his foolishness, the nation was divided, and you have what's called the northern kingdom, and then the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom was Judah. Its capital city was Jerusalem. The northern kingdom was Israel. Its capital city was Samaria. And that happened all the way up until the Babylonian exile. And after the exile, when the people went back to the nation, the remnant, then they were one nation. There was no more a northern and southern kingdom. All right, we'll pick it up at verse 18 in the next study. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comments section below. All comments are welcome, and I'll see you in the next study.